All right, so today we're diving deep into a piece of Cold War history.
Okay.
That sounds like, honestly, something straight out of Star Wars, but I
Yeah.
promise you it's 100% real.
Yeah. We're talking about a time when
Like, this really happened.
the Soviets, they decided, hey, you know what would spice up the space race? How about we launch a cannon into orbit?
I mean, you've got Sputnik, you've got Yuri Gagarin,
Right.
you've got the moon landing, all these big, iconic moments that, define the Cold War space race, right?
Right.
But lurking in the shadows was this completely unexpected project.
Yeah.
A Soviet space cannon.
Wow.
Not a model,
Yeah.
not a prototype, but an actual firing cannon bolted to a space station hurtling around the Earth.
It's a story that,
Oh,
come
yeah.
on, perfectly encapsulates the paranoia and the one-upmanship
Yeah.
that really fueled the space race.
Right.
You see, after the Americans landed on the moon,
Yeah,
the Soviets were feeling the pressure.
for sure.
They needed a win.
Yeah.
They needed something big.
Yeah.
Something that would demonstrate their technological superiority.
So naturally, they set their sights on
Right.
space artillery.
Well, I mean, it wasn't quite that simple.
Okay.
They'd already started their
Yeah.
Almaz program,
Okay.
which was, on the surface,
Okay.
their answer to America's Skylab space station.
Okay.
However, the Soviets,
Yeah.
ever distrustful,
Right.
were convinced that the Americans were using Skylab for more than just scientific research.
They were spying.
They believed, with some justification,
Yeah.
that the U.S. was developing space-based reconnaissance capabilities.
So spy satellites.
In other words, spy satellites.
So it's a classic case of they're doing it, so we need to do it bigger and better.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But it goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
You see, the Soviets were terrified
Okay.
of a surprise attack from space.
Mm.
They had a real, visceral fear
Okay.
of American spacecraft,
Right.
armed with who knows what,
Yeah.
taking out their satellites or even, attacking their territory from orbit.
I'm starting to see where the space cannon idea might have seemed
Right.
maybe not, logical, but at least understandable
Exactly.
in their mindset.
They were looking for that ultimate deterrent.
Right.
A way to say, hey, America,
Yeah.
we see your fancy space program,
Okay.
and we're one step ahead.
And what better way to send that message than with a giant orbiting cannon, right?
Mhm.
So let's talk about the star of our show, this magnificent weapon they designed,
Oh,
the
yeah.
R23M Karsh cannon. This thing was a beast.
Oh, yeah.
It was originally designed for a supersonic bomber, right?
It was. The Tupolev 222 blinder, to be exact.
Okay.
The R23M was no pea shooter. It was a rapid-fire cannon
Okay.
capable of spitting out 23-millimeter rounds at an astonishing rate of, are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Hit me.
5,000 rounds per minute.
Good Lord.
Now, imagine taking that kind of firepower
Wow.
and putting it in space.
It's the ultimate speak softly and carry a big stick move, right?
Right.
Except in this case, the stick is a cannon that fires 83 rounds per second.
83 rounds per second. And don't let the fact that it was designed for a bomber fool you.
Right.
The Soviets made some significant modifications to make it,
Yeah.
space-worthy.
Yeah.
They had to account for the vacuum of space,
Right.
the extreme temperatures,
Right.
and, of course, the unique challenges of firing a weapon in zero gravity.
Right. So we've established that the Soviets were paranoid,
Yeah.
that they loved their big guns,
They love their big gun.
and that they were perfectly willing to stick those guns on anything that went into space.
Anything.
But did they actually fire this thing?
Hmm.
And if so, how did that even work?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. We know that the cannon was installed on what was officially known as the Salyut 3 space station,
Okay.
which was actually the second Almaz military station in
Huh.
disguise.
Sneaky Soviets. Always with the secret identities for their space stations.
Indeed. Now, the test firing took place on January 24th, 1975.
Okay.
The station was unmanned at this point.
Wait, hold on. So they sent this thing up with a crew on it,
Right.
lived on it, probably ate borscht in zero gravity,
Probably, yeah.
and then sent the cosmonauts home before test firing a weapon that could probably punch a hole in their living quarters?
When you put it like that.
Yeah.
Yes. You see, they had tried to account for the recoil.
Okay.
They were smart guys.
Okay.
They used the station's maneuvering thrusters to counteract the force of the cannon firing.
Right.
But even with those precautions,
Okay.
firing a weapon that powerful in space was a very risky proposition.
I imagine a couple of loose screws after a test firing wouldn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence in the whole space station as a comfortable living space marketing campaign. Not really.
So the station's empty, the cannon's locked and loaded. What happens next?
They fired it.
They fired it.
Just hours before deorbiting the station,
Oh.
they let loose with that cannon, sending a stream of 23mm rounds out into the vastness of space. Talk about going out with a bang.
Literally.
Literally.
I bet that made for one heck of a fireworks show.
Oh, yeah.
For anyone lucky enough to be looking in the right direction.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, did it actually work? I mean, shooting a gun in space can't be as simple as it looks in the movies.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's not like the movies make it out to be.
Right.
Imagine this. You are trying to hit a target that's potentially thousands of kilometers away.
Right.
Also moving at thousands of kilometers per hour.
And you're doing this while floating around in a metal box with a cannon that's trying to rip itself free every time it fires.
Yeah, that paints a slightly more chaotic picture than Hollywood usually goes for.
Yeah.
I'm starting to think that strapping a cannon to a space station,
Nice.
while undeniably awesome, might have been
a
tad optimistic.
It
So
was.
for the Soviets.
Yeah, well, I mean, optimism, perhaps fueled by a bit of desperation,
Sure.
was a hallmark of the Cold War space race, right?
Yeah.
But even they had to admit that the space cannon had its limitations.
Right.
For one thing, even with their best efforts to counteract it, the recoil was a major issue. Every time they fired that thing,
Yeah.
it nudged the entire station off course.
It's like trying to hit a bullseye with a dart while riding a unicycle on a trampoline.
An apt analogy.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of debris. You know, blowing up a satellite with a cannon might sound effective in theory,
Right.
but it creates this cloud of shrapnel
Right.
that could pose a very serious threat to other spacecraft,
Right.
including, potentially their own.
Right, of course. Space junk, the ultimate case of what goes up must come down.
Right.
Except sometimes it doesn't, and then it runs into your multi-billion-dollar satellite. So if the space cannon was a dead end, what did the Soviets turn to next?
Well, having learned some hard lessons, I think, about the practicality of space-based artillery,
Right.
they shifted their focus to something a bit more conventional,
Okay.
at least in the context of Cold War weaponry.
Missiles.
Ah, yes, the old reliable missile. Because what's more comforting than the thought of nuclear-tipped rockets flying over your head?
Right. But I imagine adapting missile technology for space presented its own unique set of challenges, right?
Absolutely. You see, missiles designed for use on Earth, within the Earth atmosphere,
Right.
they rely on aerodynamic forces for guidance and control.
Right.
They use fins, wings to maneuver through the air, adjusting their trajectory based on, air pressure, wind resistance, things like that.
But in space.
In space, it's a whole different ball game.
Right.
There's no air to push against. There's no wind to account for.
Right.
It's a vacuum,
Right.
which means those traditional aerodynamic control surfaces, they're useless.
So how do you steer a missile in space? It's not like you can just put a little joystick on it and let the cosmonauts have a go.
Well, they did consider some
Yeah.
other imaginative solutions early on, but ultimately they realized that they needed a more refined approach.
Okay.
Entered the Strabiddle Sputnikov program.
Which, if my Russian isn't too rusty, translates to
Satellite killer.
satellite killer.
Yeah.
Catchy.
Not exactly subtle,
No.
but certainly to the point.
I appreciate their commitment to clear branding.
Right.
So how did these satellite killers actually work? Were they packing miniature space cannons?
Not quite. These were essentially kamikaze satellites designed to, get up close and personal with their targets.
Right.
They would maneuver themselves into close proximity to an enemy satellite and then detonate, essentially, a shrapnel warhead,
Okay.
blasting it with a cloud of high-speed metal fragments.
Okay, so less laser beams and more shotgun blast in space.
There you go.
Effective, if a bit messy.
Indeed. But as you can imagine, achieving that level of precision in space was no mean feat. I mean, remember, we're talking about the 1970s here.
Right.
The sophisticated guidance systems and onboard computers we take for granted today
Right.
were still, essentially science fiction.
So how did they ensure that these things actually hit their targets? It seems, we're talking about hitting a bullet with another bullet, except those bullets are millions of dollars and traveling at thousands of miles per hour.
It was a very complex
Oh.
and some might say rather ambitious system
Okay.
that relied very, very heavily on ground-based tracking and control.
Oh.
They used powerful radar systems to monitor the positions of both the satellite killer and its target, relaying commands to adjust the missile's trajectory and make sure it was on the right course.
So I'm picturing a room full of Soviet scientists huddled around a giant radar screen,
Yeah.
frantically calculating trajectories
Yeah.
and barking orders into headsets.
You're not far off.
Yeah.
It's a very tense, demanding process.
Right.
Very little room for error.
Yeah.
And even with their best efforts,
Right.
there were
Incidents.
incidents.
As in,
Well, let me just give you an example.
okay.
In one notable test,
Yeah.
the satellite killer successfully intercepted its target.
Okay.
But instead of, completely obliterating it as intended,
Right.
the shrapnel merely kind of nudged the target satellite into a different orbit.
Oops.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It just highlighted the very unpredictable nature of, operating in space.
Right.
Even the slightest miscalculation
Right.
could have very, very unintended consequences.
Right.
And then, of course, there are the reliability issues.
Reliability issues. Please don't tell me these things had a tendency to explode prematurely.
Let's just say that the launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome saw its fair share of unexpected fireworks during those years.
Right. So not exactly the kind of track record that inspires a lot of confidence in your space weaponry.
Yeah.
With all these challenges, did the Soviets ever actually deploy any of these satellite killers operationally?
Well, while the Soviets did conduct numerous tests, operational deployments of these early satellite killers remain, shrouded in secrecy.
Right.
It's likely that, the technical hurdles and the inherent risks made them think twice about, actually unleashing these unpredictable weapons in the very high-stakes game
Yeah.
of Cold War espionage.
It's a good reminder that even at the peak of Cold War tensions, cooler heads often prevailed,
Yeah.
at least some of the time.
At least some of the time.
But while the Soviets were busy, experimenting with their space cannons and exploding satellites, the Americans weren't exactly sitting on their hands, were they?
Oh, not at all.
Right.
The U.S. had their own ideas
Okay.
about how to project power in space.
Right.
Remember that fear of being caught off guard,
Of course.
that shock of Sputnik.
Right.
It lit a fire under the American space program, a fire fueled by both scientific ambition,
Yeah.
but also, let's be honest,
Right.
a healthy dose of Cold War paranoia.
So while the Soviets were focused on turning their space stations into armed fortresses,
Right.
what was the American approach?
Well, they explored a more, I guess you could say, multi-layered strategy.
Okay.
They were developing both offensive and defensive capabilities.
Okay.
On the offensive side,
Right.
they invested very, very heavily in anti-satellite missiles.
Okay.
They were aiming for, a more controlled, more precise way to
Right.
take out those enemy spacecraft.
So less shotgun blast, more surgical strike.
Precisely. They understood that in the vastness of space, accuracy was absolutely paramount,
Right.
but they didn't stop there.
Okay.
They also poured resources into ground-based laser systems.
Hold on. Lasers, as in like pew pew,
Yeah.
lasers that could shoot down satellites from Earth.
Well, I mean, it wasn't quite as simple as just,
Yeah.
pointing and shooting.
Sure.
These were incredibly powerful lasers designed to either disrupt or completely destroy, the very sensitive optics and electronics
Right.
of enemy satellites.
Okay.
Um,
I imagine those could also double as like a pretty impressive light show
I'm sure.
if they ever got bored over there.
Right.
But let's be honest, when it comes to Cold War space programs, things always seem to escalate.
Always.
Did the U.S. ever consider anything, a little more unconventional?
Let's just say that the Americans had their fair share of ambitious, some might even say outlandish projects during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And when it came to, space-based weaponry, they weren't afraid to think outside the box.
Okay.
Or, perhaps more accurately, inside the blast radius.
Inside the blast radius.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you've piqued my curiosity here.
Oh.
What kind of blast radius are we talking about?
Let me introduce you to something called Project Excalibur.
Mhm.
Okay, imagine this. A constellation of satellites, each armed with a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser.
Okay, you're going to have to back up and unpack that one for me.
Okay.
A nuclear pumped laser.
Yes.
Like powered by a nuclear reactor.
Not exactly a reactor, but you're on the right track.
Okay.
The idea was to use the energy released by a nuclear explosion in space to power essentially an incredibly powerful X-ray laser.
So they wanted to detonate nuclear bombs in space to create a weaponized laser beam.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
The theory was that this X-ray laser would be powerful enough to destroy multiple ballistic missiles in flight.
Okay.
It was their version of a space-based missile defense shield.
I can see how detonating nuclear weapons in space might have been a tad controversial, even at the height of Cold War tensions.
You could say that again.
Right.
The project faced significant pushback.
Yeah.
Both from, within the government and
Yeah.
from the international community, of course.
Sure.
And then, beyond the political challenges, there were the technical challenges.
Right. I can only imagine
Yeah.
trying to wrangle a nuclear explosion into a focused beam of energy just sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was a risky proposition, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, Project Excalibur never actually made it past, the testing phase.
Right.
There were just too many unknowns, too many potential consequences.
Yeah.
Even for a world, that was on the brink of nuclear war.
It's probably for the best that some ideas stay confined to the drawing board.
Right.
Especially when those ideas involve exploding things in space.
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder, what were they thinking?
Well, I think, it speaks to the level of fear
Right.
and desperation that existed during the Cold War.
Right.
Both sides were so convinced that the other one was seeking some sort of technological advantage that they were willing to entertain, almost any idea, no matter how far-fetched, in the name of national security.
Yeah, it's kind of a sobering thought. So if giant space lasers weren't the answer, what was? What direction did the U.S. ultimately take?
Well, I think they realized that winning the space race, or at least, not losing it, required a more pragmatic approach.
Okay.
They focused on, refining their existing technologies, things like anti-satellite missiles, developing more reliable, more precise weapon systems.
Right.
They also, invested very heavily in intelligence gathering, trying to always stay one step ahead of Soviet capabilities.
It sounds like the U.S. learned a very valuable lesson about the importance of kind of balance, of not letting fear completely dictate every move in the space race.
Exactly. It was about finding that sweet spot, between technological innovation, strategic thinking, and, responsible restraint.
Which, in a way, brings us full circle, doesn't it?
It does.
The Cold War may be over, but that competition for space, it continues.
It absolutely does.
Nations are still, vying for influence, for advantage in this new frontier.
For sure.
And as we've seen from this deep dive, the line between, just scientific exploration and military ambition can be, blurry at best, right?
It can be very blurry.
Yeah.
It's a very fine line.
It makes you wonder what other secrets of the Cold War space race are still waiting to be uncovered. What other strange and terrifying projects might be hidden away in some, dusty archive somewhere?
My friend, is a question for another deep dive.
Until then, keep looking up at the stars and maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for the space cannons and the nuclear-powered lasers that never quite made it off the drawing board.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that almost happened.